Kia ora everyone, and thank you for joining us again. We've been so lucky over the course of these conversations during COVID to talk about everything from education, looking after one another's well-being and mental health, and also the economy. Today, I'm very lucky to be joined by Professor Tahu Kukutai, who is a Māori and Indigenous demographic specialist, and also Tracey McIntosh, a professor in Indigenous Studies, focusing on sociology and criminology. They're also both part of our Science Advisory Network. So welcome, Morena, to both of you. Thank you for joining us.
Jacinda.
I'll start off as I do with everyone. How are your respective bubbles?
Well, so in my bubble, I have my husband, who's an essential worker, 3 kids. Normally we have my father, who's 80 years old, but he has COPD, and we made the call before entering lockdown that he would go and self-isolate with his partner in a 2-bubble household in Hamilton. So he's since rejoined our bubble, so we have our 3-generational bubble back intact. We also managed to pick up 2 cats just before lockdown. So with 3 kids, 3 cats, my dad and my husband leaving for work every day, it's a very lively bubble. And on some days it's basically controlled chaos. And you know, with the amount of Zooms that I have every day, the 5-year-old has made an unplanned cameo appearance in every single one of them. So we may have a kid or a cat turn up.
No, this is the new feature of life. I have to say that Neve's made a bit of appearance in some of my dad's Zoom calls as well. Tracey, what about you?
So I've also got a 3-generational bubble, and we actually have a 3-generational household. In fact, sometimes we've had a 4-generational household. So my parents have lived with us for over 20 years. I lost my father only really recently, actually, and so that was sort of an interesting space for us, particularly for my mum. My parents have been married for 65 years, and there's just something about, I think, during the quarantine and also still being in a grieving space. But in many ways, it's been a really good space for us as well, to be able to remember that, to recognise our strengths as a collective. We also had this household has sometimes a very large household, because we're a blended family with 7 children. So we've got our bubbles sort of have been elsewhere. Some of that's been to protect mum as well, and also people were coming in. But our bubble also extended as we went to level 3 on Tuesday. So, you know, that's been wonderful. 2 dogs and a cat, many a Zoom meeting, lots of people in this household working still. But, you know, we've been very privileged in terms of the group that we are together.
You both have intergenerational households, and my household became one for this period. Do you think that there will have been people within Aotearoa who will have experienced for the first time intergenerational bubbles, and what do you think there is that we can learn from that? Because personally, I found it a really positive thing.
I guess that also having a long-term intergenerational household, it's just something important about what it does across generations, you know, and it is around some of that intergenerational transfer of knowledge, and that goes both ways. Earlier in the setup for this, for example, I was being explained something very clearly, which I could not understand, and I was able to draw on the beautiful experience of youth that sits in this household to help me with that. So that intergenerational transfer goes both ways, and there is something that is really just the way that it nurtures us. And I guess particularly for us within Māori households and in Pacific households, you know, where this is quite a significant dimension of many households' lives, that I'm glad that other households get to share it.
Tahu, in your experience, in your research, is that something that's held in the way that we're making up our households and our makeup of society? Do you think we'll see a return to it?
Oh, look, even before the lockdown and pandemic, that all the data showed that the sorts of living arrangements that Māori and Pacific whānau have are quite different from Pākehā New Zealanders. And that goes back a long way as well. So that sort of living in place collectively is sort of normal and natural. Now, whether that sort of continues after the bubble breaks, I think is really up to us. But I think what the pandemic has made really clear is that living lives of isolation as individuals is not really a flourishing life, and that intimacy of connectedness, of knowledge transfer, of having fun between generations, of spending time together is something that's an intrinsic part of living well.
And these are just some of the things that I think that we should keep talking about, regardless of where we are in our response post-COVID. Tell me some of the other things that, from your perspectives and from your areas of expertise, you've picked up in our response, things that we should be learning from, things that we could have done differently, particularly from the science advisory perspective.
Well, look, one of the strong messages that I'm really getting from across my networks, which are pretty diverse, is that sort of the power of community. And what has been so amazing, I think, in the last 4 weeks is the ability and the capacity of Māori communities, whether it's marae-based, whether it's hapu, whether it's iwi, whether it's urban, to sort of anticipate the needs of their people and to be able to rapidly respond, and whether that's implementing checkpoints, which I think were a very effective public health measure and absolutely critical in those rural communities, which were isolated and nowhere near medical help if they needed it. Whether it's the delivery of kind of care packages to kaumātua and whānau who needed it, whether it's offering cultural support in times of grief, and so having a kaumātua zoom into a whānau and be able to support them when they're holding a small tangi in their bubble. That capacity to offer different kinds of assistance when whānau need it has been truly remarkable. And that's not just, I think, that's not just the power of manaakitanga, that's also actually reflective of the deep knowledge and local intelligence that a lot of communities actually hold. And I feel like sometimes that's not really adequately tapped into. And I think moving ahead, we really need to sort of think about what are the ways in which we can really make the most of the powerful forms of sort of leadership that exist in our communities and that local intelligence, so that it really connects and we really, so that whānau and households and communities are enabled to be active participants in the recovery moving forward in a way that actually meets their needs.
I think it's fair to say, well, some of these things we haven't had a chance to amplify nearly as much as we should have, because some of those community-based initiatives have been critical to the response. Tracey, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that active element of participation, what Māori do particularly well, incredibly well, is around collectivity. Very much kaupapa-led elements, and the way that we see within Pacific communities a really strong mission-led response to that. We have this really strong kaupapa-led response, really collective, and I think that's been a really important element. And I have a wonderful source in the East Coast who's sort of been talking about just what's been done in their communities, small communities like the Kaha, for example, which are tiny. The level of support for kaumātua, the types of really innovative decision making where they can actually put out their lists of what they want, at the letterbox and people get picked up. Even the way they've dealt with how they can do that contactless, but also how they've dealt with payment structures and indeed non-payment structures. Really strong. The cover of COVID-19 has been really important, taking on those protocols in terms of a public health one, but adding that dimension, the dimension in terms of manaakitanga, in terms of mātauranga Māori. And so I think those elements, we've seen it with the way that iwi chairs, for example, have collaborated in sometimes new and innovative ways. But for me in my work, one of the areas that really stands out is, particularly from what we would call in policy term hard to reach communities, those that often characterised by lives of scarcity and deprivation, characterised by high levels of marginalisation, characterised by historical forms of racism, particularly within gang whānau and others. We've seen the way that they've collectively been able to mobilise, support each other, and not just support each other. Actually, it's a way that I see that they reach out to their broader community. So we've seen, you know, in terms of some really difficult, in some communities which face significant day-to-day challenges, the way that members have really worked hard, incredible creativity, wonderful innovation. I think in thinking about things that, and in thinking about that and in thinking about our response for March 15, we saw a very similar element. We saw parts of the